Hello, everyone. It is a great joy to be here. I think most of you know that Devi and I have been with Swamiji since the very beginning time of Ananda, and we thought tonight that you might enjoy hearing a little bit about our life with Swamiji, and then also about the future of what we see for the work, especially here in India. This is our first time here at the center. It's beautiful. Congratulations to all of you who've had a part in making this happen. It's very, very nice. One of the things that I did with Swamiji was to go many years ago to Calcutta with him, and we were there actually when we first went, this was in 1974, we met Master's brother, Sananda Lal Ghosh, and were connected with him for a little while, and then he took us to some places that you don't see very often. There was a little room where there was a meditation group that went all the way back to Master's time there in Calcutta. And it met in a little library. If you remember some of the stories, he and Tulsi Bose and some others started a little library. They went around and raised funds for it and got books. And he took us to that original library, and it was very interesting. So Swamiji's connection, of course, goes back to Master. Swamiji met Master in 1948. After he read the autobiography of a yogi. And he read that in New York and came immediately to the West Coast. He'd been seeking. Many of you, most of you probably know Swamiji's story, so I won't go into that a great deal except to say that he had a very deep, deep yearning to know the truth. At that stage in his life, he had not yet equated knowing truth with knowing God. He just had a hunger to know the truth of the universe. And he's often said to me that most people are interested in how things work. I'm much more interested in why they work. And so he was interested in that spiritual search. And that brought him to Master, and he spent the last 3.5 years with Master until Master's parting in 1952. And then Swamiji was still with that organization, SRF, YSS. He spent several years here in India from about 1958 to 1962. And then after his parting with SRF, he went into a period where he wasn't quite sure of what his mission was supposed to be, what his life was supposed to be. He wanted to serve his guru, but he wasn't sure how to do that. And so in about 1964 or 1965, he realized that he had to begin to teach. He had to begin to share that which he had been given. And it was shortly after that that I met Swamiji. I met him in 1966, and I took the first series of classes from him in 1967. So that was just 15 years after Master's passing, after the time Swamiji had been with Master. And so I began taking his classes in San Francisco, which is where I met him. The original Ananda Center was smaller than this building. The whole of Ananda was his one-bedroom apartment in San Francisco, and he had a room a little bit smaller than this, but nearly this size. And in that room, he would give satsangs once a week. And other than that, he would travel around and he gave classes. He gave a series of classes that one night of the week in different cities, he would give basically the same class. It would be about an hour of Hatha Yoga, and then there would be a little break. People could get some food, eat some food if they brought it. And then there would be a class for an hour or a little more in Raja Yoga, basically how to meditate. And so he gave a class series that lasted for 6 weeks. That's the basis of what we still teach now. We still teach meditation 1, 2, 3, 4, the progression of that. That was all from what Swamiji started in those early days. So I began taking those classes with him in March of 1967, a few months after I had met him. And I was very, very taken with him. I had read the autobiography of a yogi, and up until that time, I couldn't say that I was at all seeking spiritually. I had a very strong desire to know what consciousness was all about, what the mind was, what our thoughts were, why we were who we were. And I studied psychology in college. That was my major. But I didn't get any of the real answers that I was seeking. Looking at experiments of how rats ran through a maze, that somehow didn't satisfy my cosmic yearnings of how consciousness worked. And after school, I didn't really know where to go, what to do. I had tried. It was as if I had tried to go down a certain avenue, a certain street, that was very typical of young people in America. I had been on a kind of a conveyor belt going through school, been a good student, had a scholarship, went to school, finished my studies, and I didn't know where my life was going after that. It wasn't something that satisfied me. The typical future that was laid out before me, to get a job, to get promotions in the job, perhaps to get rich, to have what looked like in those days a normal life, it just didn't attract me at all. And so I was very much looking for what the meaning of life was, but I certainly did not in the beginning define that as something that was spiritual. In fact, I was not very religious. In those days I would have defined myself as an agnostic, one of those people who doesn't believe that God exists, but leaves open the possibility that it could be true, and lets others make up their own mind. But then I read Autobiography of a Yogi, and that book answered all of the questions not all of the questions, because I was a questioning young man, but it gave me the basis to understand the scope of consciousness, the cosmic consciousness, the growth of the individual mind or thoughts to expand and expand until we became one with everything. And that very much excited me. And so it was after reading that I met Swamiji and began taking his classes. Well, I was charmed by Swamiji, as all of us who knew him had been. And in those days, he was very dynamic. He was, this was in 1967, so he was about 40 years old, 39 or 40 years old at that time. And very, very dynamic. He would, as I said, he would do this series of classes, and he would do one night in San Francisco and another night in different cities around the Bay Area, and he was always driving. And during the day, he was answering correspondence. He was all alone. He had a little temporary secretary who helped him a little bit, but basically he was doing the whole of the work all by himself. And Master used the phrase one time that he was stirring the ether. And that's what Swamiji was doing. He was stirring the ether. And around him grew a group of students who were more than usually interested. And that's why he had the satsangs on Thursday night, Guru Day, in his apartment, and those who wanted more would come, and we would chant, and he wanted to involve everyone, so he would give out instruments. People would have bells and rattles, and he had me, because I kept coming over and over again, he taught me how to play the madranga, taught me a couple of rhythms so that I could accompany him on the chanting. There would be about 20 minutes or so of chanting, and then a meditation, and then he would give a short discourse and then answer questions. And so when I took his series of classes one time, and there wasn't much more to do except take them the next time he came around. So I took the same series, and then the next time he came back and gave them in San Francisco, I took them again. And so, being the only student that kept repeating that way, he decided that I would become his assistant and help him. So I would carry a suitcase full of books or records, and I would take the class fee as people entered, and gradually we just formed an association. And very quickly he had me teaching. In fact, my very first class was that he asked people in the classes if they would like to have an advanced Hatha Yoga class. And many, many people raised their hands. Yes, yes, yes. So he arranged to have that. And when the time came, only 6 students signed up for it. And Swamiji was too busy to devote a whole night to teaching just 6 students, because usually his classes would have 20, 30, 40 people in them. So he said, well, you teach that class. Well, I'd never had that class. He'd never given it to me. So I was supposed to give the advanced Hatha Yoga class, never having had it. So what I did was basically have the same postures, but we held them longer. That was my solution to that dilemma. And then after about a year, Swamiji asked me, at that time I had a job as a social worker, and I was wanting to serve.
Do you know what that term means?
A social worker? It's, yeah. And so I had a special group of people that I worked with, were those with particular difficulties. I was always working with older people, but some were alcoholics, some had medical difficulties, but not the typical people. They were ones who had special needs. And one of the things that I saw was, and I'm sure that God arranged this for me, is that I was really wanting to help people. I had a serviceful nature. And so I would help these people. I would help, for instance, a person who suffered from alcoholism. And they were always getting into trouble. They would be belligerent, and they would get thrown out of whatever hotel they were living in. And so I would have to find them another hotel. 2 weeks later, they'd get thrown out of that hotel, and the problems recurred and recurred and recurred. At the same time, I saw people taking the classes that Swamiji was giving, and they were having life-changing breakthroughs. Their lives were changing. And I saw very clearly that we cannot change the world by changing outer circumstances. People will just go back to whatever they were doing, improve their circumstances without changing their consciousness, and they just revert right back to the problems. And so I realized that if I was going to be helpful to the people, to the world, that it had to do with helping them change consciousness, change the inside and the outside circumstances, readjust themselves to the new inner person. And so I saw that lesson very clearly. Then when Swamiji asked me to be his assistant full-time, asked me to quit that job and work with him, then I did that, and we worked together in San Francisco for about a year or a little more until we both moved up. And at that time, we also had the first property up. It was about a 3.5 hour drive. Actually, it was a 3.5 hour drive for normal people. It was less than a 3-hour drive for Swamiji. He always had energy, and that translated into he always drove very quickly. And he just had tremendous energy in those days. And we would go up on the weekends and help build the first buildings, and it looks very familiar out here at the Pune community to me, because it was the same kind of a project. You are very, very far advanced over what we had at that time. All we had was a water tower. That was the whole of it. One time we had gone up for a weekend, and we were trying to construct a temple. And we were using the wrong method. And it was a geodesic dome, and we got it almost constructed. It took us about 3 days, and then it collapsed, and it just shattered. All the pieces, the parts were just in ruins. And at that time, there were no buildings, so we just had sleeping bags, and we laid those on the ground, and we cooked over a little camp stove, and that's how we were doing that project at that time. There were 3 or 4 other people. And so on Saturday night, the whole building had collapsed, and it was nighttime. We just had our meal and meditated and went to sleep. And in the morning, I heard Swami very softly saying something. His sleeping bag was, about as far away as Anil is over there. So it may be 8 or 10 feet. And I heard him saying something very softly under his breath. And having been a psychology student, I understood. He'd had this tragic trauma that had happened the night before, and he was sad, and he was expressing his difficulties, and I didn't want to intrude on his space. I wanted to give him time to have his little grieving process. And so being a psychology student, I knew these things. But I couldn't help but kind of listen in. And what I heard was, joy, joy, joy. And I realized that the outer things weren't affecting his inner state at all. And so that was a very important experience for me. You know, each of us have these little obstacles that we have, little hurdles that we individually have to get over. And one of my individual hurdles was that I had always had a little skepticism of a person who might be able to teach eloquently but didn't live according to that which he taught. That was the state of most of my professors in college, so I was well trained in this. But hearing that from Swamiji and seeing it in action and then seeing it over and over and over again, it was a very different experience. So I began working very closely with him, and then when we moved to Ananda property by the spring of 1969, very quickly we had to get a second property, and the details of that aren't too important, but Swamiji lived in one of the areas, and I lived in the other area. We had 2 properties, and I was the general manager of Ananda for the first 10 years or so. So on almost a daily basis, I would confer with Swamiji, and he had several principles that he worked with. One was that he always looked at people's energy, not the form very much, but the energy. So he would look to see whether a person was energetic whether they were doing activities. He'd never demanded of people, but he always watched. So he watched to see who among those people voluntarily were coming to meditations, who was choosing to work hard, who was choosing to take responsibility. And he was watching that, and of those who actually were putting out positive energy, then he gave more energy. And so gradually, because I was being the manager at that time, he taught me one of the principles of leadership that he had was give more energy to positive people than to negative people. Basically, ignore the negative people. Don't try to work with them. Don't try to convince them that they should do what they should do. He said, because usually all you will be able to do is get them back to neutral, and then they'll revert back to their negative ways. He said, work with positive people. If you give more energy to positive people, they can take that energy in, and that raises their energy, and then a magnetic vortex is created of positive energy, forward-moving energy. And then the tamasic people that don't want to be around that high energy, they gradually understand and they leave. And so the process in the early years of Ananda Village was that we had some groups of people who, in the first year especially, were kind of always complaining and never wanting to do very much. And we had a beautiful river nearby, and they would go to the river and spend their days. And they would say basically, Swamiji and the rest of those people who work all the time, they're all uptight. And they said, God will take care of us. And then when Swami paid the rent, they said, see, God is taking care of us. And when the rest of us did all the tasks, see, God takes care of all of this stuff. But they didn't last long. They moved on pretty quickly. And so Swami said, put your energy into those people who are positive. The complainers, don't try to argue with them, because they'll just continue complaining. He said, people of that sort, if you answer one question, they'll come up with two more. Answer both of those, you have 4 questions, and so it goes. And you can never satisfy them. Work with positive energy. But he was extremely energetic. He worked constantly. And of course, he had this deep meditative life, but he was on fire to serve Master. He knew that Master, more than any other of Master's disciples, he knew that Master came with a world mission, with a mission that could change society as a whole, and he had vowed to do everything in his power to help that mission be accomplished. And so he would basically give all of the classes, and then he would give interviews, and then he would chant, and then he would sing songs. We're going to have a song by the singers later, some of his music. He would entertain us in the evenings, and in the afternoon, when he wasn't busy elsewise, he would be writing. And he wrote the course which has become Raja Yoga. He was working on that course at that time. Constantly busy, and then he would travel giving classes, because that drew the income necessary. And it took a year or two for the rest of us to understand the level of energy that was necessary. And then we began starting businesses and finding ways to produce income. I myself, I'm certainly not a businessman. It was never my temperament. But I started one of the first businesses at Ananda simply because I knew that it needed to be done. And so it was we made incense and some scented oils. And at one time, it employed about 25 people. in the community. Not very high wages, but enough for us to stay there, enough for us to stay on the land. And so it was gradually, year by year, we got more coordinated. Pretty soon we got more organized, and those people who didn't like organization, they didn't want anybody telling them they had to work and so on, they drifted off because it was just too high energy. It was too focused for them to want to stay there. And so gradually the community got more and more focused. Always the basis was deep attunement with Master. Swamiji would give every Sunday, he gave what we call Sunday service, but it was basically a satsang. It was basically a lecture. And he would take some subject that was important, and he would talk about that. And he would talk about it not just theoretically, but he would talk about these beautiful principles of Master and how they applied to our life together in the community. And so week by week by week, and by that time Devi had come and Jayaji had come. He was actually one of the students in San Francisco that came occasionally to those satsangs in Swamiji's apartment, and a few others, Shivani, who you know, and a number of others. Sadhana Devi was there in the early years. So people that you know who have come and have been a part here in India were all part of that early group. And then 7 years into the community, we had a big forest fire. And I'll let Devi tell about that if she chooses to. But I just want to talk about some of the lessons that we learned from Swamiji. So one of the lessons was high energy. And as I said, he didn't care very much what kind of work people did. As long as that work was done in attunement with the spiritual principles that we have and done with high energy and creativity. And so he always let people have quite a bit of self-choice in how they wanted to put their energy out. But and that was important. But he also watched and gave more and more responsibility to those who would take that responsibility and work with it to help other people. And so gradually what Swamiji was teaching us was, one, how to be grounded, how to work hard, how to focus our energy, how to tune in to Master, because we had daily meditations just as we have at the community, and many of you have here. I don't know if you have daily meditations here at this. Yeah, and so even in San Francisco, Swami would hold a meditation in the morning at his apartment, and I would drive across town to attend that meditation. And so meditation, Kriya Yoga, the teachings were always the fundamental basis, but then to apply those teachings with high energy. And then gradually the time came where after about 10 years in the community, where we had only the first community, only Ananda Village, we got to have more and more people who wanted centers, wanted Ananda energy where they were, because they couldn't always drive 2 or 3 hours, whatever it took. And so we began to establish the city centers. And the very, very first city center was established by Haridas, who many of you know, and Vijay, who is now serving up in Noida, Swami Vijay. And Haridas, the two of them often had disagreements about how you should proceed. And Haridas had a very funny statement a few years later. He said, Sacramento, yes. That's where I learned that there can be two God's wills. So That was the very first. And then very soon after that, Devi and I established our first large city center, which was in San Francisco. We had a very large house. Eventually, it started out just in a small apartment, but very quickly, in a few months, we got a large, frankly, it was a mansion, because it had 44 rooms in one of the nicest parts of San Francisco. It's not that we wanted a mansion. It was the only house that was big enough to hold a lot of people. And we had 30 or 35 people living with us there. And that began to establish the pattern of having city centers and eventually city ashrams. And then gradually we have established now city centers or residential communities. It started out with that large house, but now even a single house, no matter how big, isn't large enough to hold the group of people in a city center of Ananda. So we get an apartment building, and people have their individual apartments, but there's group meditation, and there's always a teaching center involved, and so classes and living together. Master said that we should have home, job, and church in one place. That's what he wanted. And as I say, it doesn't have to be rural, but he also very strongly said that we should have rural property. But it does help to have an environment where people can work together and worship together and live together if possible. If not, then we have city centers where people come and they can have sangha, they can have satsanga together. And that too is very important. We'll talk a little more about that on Thursday night, but I want to give you a little history of Ananda. So there was a phase where Ananda was spreading out in different communities. And then it wasn't enough just to stay in America. So Swami had a friend in Italy who kept calling him to come and teach there. So we established the work in Italy. And Devi and I got to live in the we're always been pioneers. And so we got to live in the early part of the work in Italy and help establish that. And we have one son. Devi will talk more, I think, about the kind of life that we've led. But we have a son and we have some grandchildren, so we can relate to those of you who are householders and who have children. It's a wonderful experience. It can be extremely helpful spiritually to have children and raise them in a dharmic way and an uplifted way. And so we've had a lot of experiences over the long period. It's now for me going on, well, it's actually almost 47 years since I first met Swamiji. And for both of us, it's been our whole adult life. We came when we were 22 or 23 years old, and we won't say how old we are now. It'll just shock you all. So, but it's been our whole life doing this work. And now we've been saying to people that with Swamiji's passing, before his passing, he called us and asked us if we would live part-time in India. And we were still needing to extricate ourselves from our responsibilities in America, but we, of course, said we would. But up until now, this was a couple of years ago when he asked that, it has felt like we visited India, but we lived elsewhere. Now we're shifting that. Now our mindset is that we live part-time in India, part-time in America, and a little bit in Europe. And basically our home now is, because of the restrictions with Indigo, our home is 15 kilos. It's the suitcase that we can take on to Indigo Airlines. Of course, that's a little bit of a joke, but but we're really becoming more and more feeling that we don't have so much a physical home as we have a spiritual home. We have the home that is the vibration created by Master and Swamiji and lived by all of us, and wherever we go, that's our home, because our home isn't a physical place, it's a vibrational energy. And so wherever we go now, we feel at home. But I must say we feel especially at home here in India. There's a resonance with that spiritual vibration that is stronger here than anywhere in the world. As Swamiji often said, India is the guru of the world. And Master came from here, our teachings came from here, the vibrations that we feel comfortable came from here. Devi and I are, in our souls, we're Indian, even though our bodies are American. And Master said that there were many Indians being born in America at this time, and many Americans being born in India at this time. So we feel more at home in the ashrams than in the shopping malls. And so the Americans being born here in India, they're more at home in the shopping malls and in business. We're more at home in the ashrams. But we couldn't find them easily in America, so we had to create one. So I'll let Devi talk.
I'll just say a few words, and then maybe we can have some questions if you like. But first of all, I too want to thank you all for coming, and especially thanks to all of you who have helped create the center, Shashir, and those of you who are helping to make it possible. It's so important to have centers like this where people can come, that they don't have to drive a long distance, because everyone's life is very busy these days. When just recently I realized, I was thinking about Swamiji's life, and I realized when he came to Master, to Guruji, when he was 22 years old. And he was with him for the last 3.5 years of Master's life. So I don't know why I never thought of this, but when Master passed away, left the body, it had his Mahasamadhi, Swamiji was 26 years old. And yet, such a young man to take on such a huge mission. And yet he did it for the rest of his life, for 60 years, unceasingly, giving and giving of his attunement, of his devotion, of his understanding of Master's path and Master's mission. Those of us who have read Autobiography of a Yogi will remember when Master's mother took him as a little baby in arms to see her guru, Lahiri Mahashaya. And Master's mother was sitting just at the back of the room, holding her little son, who was, of course, an avatar. But Lahiri Mahashaya recognized the nature of that soul, and he beckoned to his mother to come forward, and he blessed the infant Mukunda, and he said, "Your son will be a great spiritual engine, drawing many souls to God." Well, I have often thought if Master Guruji was a great engine, then Swamiji was the conductor of the train, saying, come on board, you don't need a ticket, just come on board. And so he got us on that train. And then Guruji is driving to take us all to God. So I can't tell you enough, as Jyotish was trying to convey in words, the tremendous gift of his life that Swamiji gave to us. Not, when I say us, I mean thousands of people in America, in Europe, in India, and each one Each soul was special to him. And in fact, those of you who never got a chance to meet him, he is still working. He is still drawing us all towards God, towards the great engine that Master is motivating up the hill of material consciousness. And once I was thinking about all the different places that Swamiji has lived. Jyotish talked about starting in the little apartment in San Francisco, and then finally he built a little dome at Ananda, a geodesic dome, at Ananda meditation retreat. And it was so simple and so primitive, one might say, but he was so pleased with it. And then finally he created the beautiful gardens and building of Crystal Hermitage. So that was his first real permanent home, one might say, Crystal Hermitage. But then he lived there a while, but then he moved on to create the work in Italy. And the little house he built there was a simple little house, and he called it Seva Kutir. So starting with Crystal Hermitage, one might say that was like the astral world. And so the names of his different houses rather trace the different stages of his life. So there was Seva Kutir in Italy, and then he came to India after that, and he called his house Guru Kripa, Guru's grace, the grace of the Guru that I can come back to India and serve here. And then finally he moved into another little house there, and he called that house Guru Prem, the Guru's love of the Guru. And then when he moved to the Pune community, they built a house for him, and Narayani just gave that house the name Guru Darshan, the vision of the Guru. So first it traces Swamiji's life, service to the Guru, the grace of the Guru, the love of the Guru, and finally the vision of the Guru, merging in the Guru. Someone asked me, where do you think Swami is now? And I said, Guru Loka. He's in the abode of the Guru. But from that Guru Loka, he's guiding all of our lives. And if we try to be attuned with him, to the extent that we do, we will find great blessings. We had a dear friend who was a dear friend of Swamiji's before Ananda started. She was a direct disciple of the great woman saint Ananda Pune, and a dear beloved friend of ours. And she said to us once, Swamiji is not always easy to perceive who he really is and to understand what he's doing. But she said, just remember, he is going to take all of you to God, and that's all you need to think about. And so for all of us, we have this wonder. We have the great avatar Paramahansaji, but then we have the life of Swami, his example of what discipleship looks like, that incredible self-offering, ceaseless. And even the last years of his life, when I look at pictures of him now, I think I didn't realize what a struggle it was, what an effort it was for him to keep going. But there was no other purpose in his life but to give and serve. And so the work continues. And I think one of Swami's gifts to all of us, he was so humble and so simple and so natural. He never held himself at a distance from people. He was everyone's friend. And so one of the things we are doing at Ananda Village now, we asked him, it was a little difficult, but about 4 years ago, we began looking to the inevitable and saying, Swamiji, the time will come when you cast off that mortal body, and what is your wish for your body? And he didn't answer us for many years. First we said, do you want us to cremate you? Do you want us to? And he wouldn't answer. And then, and we didn't understand why he wasn't giving us direct guidance. And then finally he was sort of frustrated with us and he said, you know, in India, they don't cremate the saints. And so he couldn't say that to us. But he was trying to get us to realize that. So we said, okay, Swamiji, we may be slow, but we get it eventually. And we said, where would you like your body to reside? And he said, well, I think it has to be Ananda Village, because that's where it started. So I will just close, and we brought with us, just for you to see, you've seen Swamiji's homes in different places, some of you, and this will be his final resting place. We wanted to share. These are some conceptual drawings of, it will be in the beautiful gardens. It will be a small, we call the Moksha Mandir, a small mandir where people can come. His body will be there under the floor. And Swami's home at Crystal Hermitage, if you follow this path, his little apartment is right there. And that will be maintained as a shrine as he lived it.
This is the Moksha Mandir, and right here is Swamiji's home. So we'll maintain that as a shrine.
And these are just different conceptual drawings. They may not be exactly as it finally is designed, but these were done by an artist that we work with, an architect. And we'll leave these.
Just to describe it a little bit, Ananda has expansive views, not unlike the community outside by Watunde, but a little more forested. And so the mandir will look out over that expansive view. And the three front windows, it's eight-sided, octagonal. And the three front windows will be floor-to-ceiling glass. So it's completely expansive, which is Swamiji's spirit. And we'll look out, and at dusk, the sun sets over those hills. It'll be very, very beautiful.
So we hope someday, God willing, you can come and this project will be completed. This is kind of an overview. If you took off the roof, you see the beams that will support the curved roof. And so
this is very like our temple in Assisi, and then we built one also in Seattle.
And we will build one.
And
we're
we
building
will.
one.
This goes first. This comes first. So we're just very happy to be here in your new center. We hope that many of you will continue to come here, meditate, take the classes from our wonderful teachers here, and then also come visit our Pune community. And as Jyotish said, we will be living here part of the time now. And if there's any way that we can serve you, we are trying to continue in the spirit of Swamiji, where we are your friends in God, and any way we can help you, it is our blessing to do so. So God bless you all.
I want to invite the singers to come. They've prepared a song.
We're going to sing I Live Without Fear.
No green summer fade, and winter draws near. My Lord, in your presence, I live without fear. Through tempest, through storm,
Thank you. Swamiji wrote that song for his mother's funeral, so it has always had a very deep meaning for him. So if anyone has a question, we'd be happy to answer them.
Shishir, Danish.
So, as Swamiji has lived such an active life, always also working outwardly. So, how does one remain in this center while being involved in the work in the world? It is easy to be drawn to the center when you're meditating, but is it possible to also act from the center and always be inside instead of being involved outside and then feeling like you're drained spiritually?
Well, first of all, Swamiji always had a very strong meditative practice. And he was also very creative in whatever he did. Gradually, more and more, he came to realize that he didn't really do anything, that it was always God doing it through him. And because his life was so dedicated to Master, everything that he did, he tried not only to do it for Master, but to do it with the sense that Master was doing it through him. Until a few years ago, it was maybe 10 or 15 years ago, he made the statement, I'm not sure any longer where Swami Kriyananda ends off and Master begins, because he always saw really it really was just the divine working through him. Now that's a high state of consciousness, and in order to perceive that, and in order to be able to hold on to that in the midst of a lot of turmoil, then you have to have a deep inner life. Swamiji also was extremely devotional. He was on the outside, he looked like a karma yogi, but on the inside he was a bhakti. And he was always inwardly chanting, connected to Master, feeling a love for Master. Last year, a visitor said that they had just visited someplace that Master had been, and asked Swami if he had visited there also. And Swami said, oh yes. And the woman said, oh, didn't you feel Master so strongly there? And Swamiji looked a little confused. He said, not particularly. I feel him strongly everywhere. So why in that spot instead of in the workplace or wherever we find ourselves? Now I know that we just gave a talk on Saturday about magnetism and how the magnetism of other people and other people's thoughts, how they draw our energy. And so I know from my own experience and from living a long life that yes, other people's thoughts affect you. Yes, in the workplace there's a lot of demands and a lot of call for our attention. But try always during the day, not always, but try often during the day to reconnect with Master, reconnect with Swamiji, even just to take a little pause. And you can close your eyes, or sometimes in a busy place I've kind of pretended I needed to rub my eyes and just do a few breaths, do a little bit of Hong Sa, or just do something that reconnects you. And if you do that periodically during the day, it will help you be centered. So meditation in the morning, meditation at night, try to keep a line during the day, and then do as often as possible what you're doing here, which is to gather together with others, because here you're feeling a very strong spiritual connected vibration, and that helps to counterbalance what you feel possibly during the day, which is not necessarily very strong. So You just keep working as you can.